Hello everyone and welcome to Know All for GCSE. Today we're going to be doing revision of every single example and case study in GCSE Geography. Today we'll be starting by looking at paper 1. In the next video we will be looking at paper 2. So the first example is an example of two tectonic hazards in contrasting countries. We're going to be looking at Nepal versus New Zealand. Now a quick footnote here that for your GCSE exams you don't have to memorise a specific case study dependent on what your school teaches you. You can revise and learn any one of your choice. Okay, so let's look at New Zealand versus Nepal. Firstly, let's look at some background information. What happened? So both of these experienced earthquakes. They both had the same magnitude earthquake of 7.8, which just means the same strength. Also, in terms of the dates that happened, they only happened within a year of each other. That's why it's really good to compare them. So Nepal had happened on the 25th of April 2015, whereas New Zealand happened on the 14th of November 2016. It's also important to consider the average GDP, which is basically the salary per person on average. Now in New Zealand it's $40,000, whereas in Nepal it's only $690. Now looking at what plate boundaries had caused each one, New Zealand was a result of two different plate boundaries, a destructive and a conservative, whereas the Nepal was only a destructive, the Indo-Australian. Now, what it says on the specification for you to know, because that was just background information, so specification requires you to know the effects and the responses. Now, the effects are divided into two, primary effects and secondary effects. So primary effects are what happens immediately after. Things like deaths, destruction, buildings, like that. So in terms of Nepal and New Zealand, we have to be comparing them. So let's look at the death toll. In New Zealand, 2 people died and 50 people were injured, whereas in Nepal, 9,000 people died and 22,000 people were injured. Now, let's compare how many buildings were destroyed. So tens of thousands of homes were destroyed in New Zealand and many buildings were destroyed, so much so that 60 people needed emergency housing. Now, in contrast, in Nepal, 800,000 buildings were destroyed and 4 million people were overnight homeless. The cost of damage. So in New Zealand, the cost of damage was 13 million, whereas in Nepal, the cost of damage in New Zealand, not 13 million, it was 8.5 billion, whereas the cost of damage in Nepal was 5 billion. So you can see there's a difference. And for once, New Zealand had a tougher toll, and this is because the buildings in New Zealand are to a higher standard. So when they're destroyed, it costs more than, say, a shack in Nepal being destroyed would. Now, obviously, another primary effect is the roads and rails being destroyed and communications being cut off. But now let's move on to secondary effects. Let's compare secondary effects. So in New Zealand, the earthquake triggered 100,000 landslides. Now, one of these landslides was really major and actually ended up blocking a river called the Clarence River, which you may be able to see on the map on the right. And this blockage then caused the flooding of 10 different farms. And furthermore, the final secondary effect that you need to remember for New Zealand is that the earthquake had generated a tsunami with waves of up to 250 metres coming inland. In terms of the secondary effects for Nepal, we saw that the earthquake had caused avalanches, where there was one in Mount Everest that killed 18 people. Many mountain roads were blocked because of these avalanches. And also because of the lack of clean water, it caused outbreaks of disease, specifically typhus. So those are the effects. Now let's look at the next thing that the specification requires you to know about this, which are the responses. What were the immediate responses and what were the long-term responses? So in terms of the immediate responses, in New Zealand, an immediate tsunami warning was issued quickly. Residents of coastal areas were told to move to higher ground. Hundreds of people were evacuated to emergency shelters, and the 200 most vulnerable people were helicopter lifted away from the area. Power was restored within 24 hours, and international warships came, providing key resources such as food, water, medicine, and portable toilets. In terms of the immediate responses in Nepal, it was definitely a lot slower because Nepal was reliant on other countries and other charities' help. It required India and China's help, which sent lots of sent teams to rescue the residents being trapped by the debris. But because there was a lack of tools, there was a lack of machinery, this slowed down all the rescue efforts. People also tried to recover the dead, treating the injured, but the damaged roads made it really hard for emergency workers to access there. Charities such as Oxfam helped with medicine, and Red Cross helped provide shelter for 130,000 people. Now finally, long-term responses. So in New Zealand, 5.3 million was given by the Kaikoura District Council to help with the rebuilding of the town's water systems, whereas in Nepal, $500 million worth of money was given for projects for rebuilding earthquake-resistant housing from the World Bank Group. Now, most road and railways were rebuilt and reopened within 2 years of New Zealand, whereas in Nepal, only one road was reinstated, and that was the one going from Nepal to Tibet. By March 2017, so within less than a year, a permanent water main had been restored that was earthquake resistant in New Zealand. In Nepal, the focus was getting as many tourists as possible. Now that is all of that studied. I hope that wasn't too much information thrown at you there. But we're now moving on to the next one, which are the examples of a tropical storm. We're looking at Typhoon Haiyan, so another one in East Asia. This was specifically the Philippines. So if you look at the map on the left-hand corner, you can see the path of this typhoon and how it mainly affected the Philippines, but it did have wider effects on places such as Vietnam and Thailand before it made landfall. So where it made landfall on the Philippines was the 8th of November 2013. Now this was one of the most powerful typhoons ever recorded, and that's why it was so destructive. But luckily, some responses that they had carried out were able to prevent lots of lives being lost. But first we have to look at primary effects and secondary effects. So primary effects, unfortunately 8,000 people died and 1 million homes were severely destroyed. 1.9 million people were therefore homeless. Strong winds therefore caused electricity lines, water supplies, and contaminated the farmland as well. The heavy rain and storm surges flooded 600,000 hectares of land, and the cost of damage for Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines was 13 million. So a way to remember that is it happened on the 8th of November 2013, so you can say it cost 13 million in 2013. Secondary effects. So because of the flooding, this triggered several landslides that blocked roads, so emergency services were unable to get to places. 5.6 million workers lost their jobs overnight because they'd lost their livelihoods, normally in farming, but in loads of other regions as well. And furthermore, the lack of clean water caused disease outbreaks, but not typhus like Nepal, dysentery. Let's look at the immediate and long-term responses now. So the immediate responses include the PAGASA, which is the Philippines Meteorological Aid, broadcasting warnings about the typhoon 2 days before. This then had a massive impact because it allowed 800,000 people to evacuate. Unfortunately, some of those people still died, however, because many of the evacuation centres were flooded, but this was still a good prevention technique because lots of people still survived. Fishermen were warned not to go into the sea, and the Philippines declared themselves in a state of emergency, which therefore enabled them to receive food, shelter and water before anything bad had happened, so they would still be able to access these resources. Furthermore, a charity NGO called Plan International constructed pit latrines for 100,000 people to prevent the spread of disease. And finally, long-term responses. So the UN had appealed for 300 million. So still, considering it was the most powerful storm, not as much as a 500 million in Nepal, but 300 million to help fund the rebuilding and the relief. Charities also built storm-resistant housing, but the main thing that the Philippines' long-term response was encouraging tourism in areas that were not so badly affected in order to generate money to reinstill and save all the effects that had happened. Okay, that's the first two examples. Let's move on to the next one, which is an example of a UK extreme weather event. We'll be looking at the Sommerset floods. So the Sommerset floods occurred between December of 2013 to February of 2014. Because of the spec suggesting three things you need to know, that's how we're going to order our content. So, firstly, you need to know the causes. What caused this flooding to happen? Now, there are three main causes for this. Firstly, between the period of December 2013 and February 2014, the Sommerset regions had experienced 3 times the average rainfall, and considering it is Britain where it rains all the time, that is a devastating amount. Furthermore, unfortunately, this coincided with the high tides, which meant that there were more of a chance of flooding. And finally, the last reason is not even a physical reason, it's a human reason, because of the fact that humans did not dredge the Sommerset rivers for 20 years. And dredging is just removing the sediment. Because they didn't dredge it, this then meant that there was so much water and already in the water that they were already saturated and couldn't carry any more water. Now we need to know the social, economic and environmental impacts. So these social impacts included the fact that 600 homes were flooded. You can see some of them in the picture on the right hand corner. Some were entirely secluded from themselves and cut off from transport, and in fact another social impact was the fact that the village of Mulchney was entirely cut off from any form of transport apart from boat, so they could not even leave the area without boat or helicopter. And the final thing of the social impact, which could coincide with the economic impact, is the fact that insurance prices had soared, which meant that people were in even worse of economic situations. Now let's talk about the economic impacts. So, unfortunately, the total cost of damage just to this region was 80 million. The local businesses had lost 1.2 million, and the tourism for the Sommerset levels had lost £200 million. Now, this is an impeccable amount of money to lose, and it just shows how vital one single area is for tourism. Finally, the environmental impacts. So because of the water containing salt naturally, this contaminated 11,500 areas of land, most of that being farmland. And if it's contaminated the farmland, this means that it's now toxic and it cannot be fertile and produce different growths. And unfortunately, this then led to even 2 years after the Sommerset floods, the soil was totally unusable, and some which was permanently unusable. Now we need to talk about how the management strategies can reduce the risk. So originally, before the floods, people had decided to create sandbags in front of their houses, which definitely worked, and the warning systems also gave people time to evacuate. In terms of preventing it next year, or for the future, £100 million was spent on turning pumping stations into permanent pumping stations, dredging the rivers regularly, and creating a tidal barrage, as well as widening the river's channel. So a lot of things are done to make sure this is never going to happen again. Wow, so we've done all of Section A's examples of 3 examples. We're now going to move on to an example of a small-scale ecosystem in the UK, which is a Slapton Ley Reed Beds. Now, I know for many of the examples I've shown you, not all of the information is on the slide. However, you should be able to notice that all of the information for the Slapton Ley Reed Beds that you need to know is on this slide here. So, you need to know what the producers are. The producers, in this case, are the things that photosynthesize. So here, they are the reed beds, these wheat-like looking structures. Now, the roots of these reeds bind the soil together, which prevents soil erosion. It also provides a habitat for sticklebacks and eels to use this as shelter. Large birds like bitterns and herons nest in the reed bed and feed off of the fish. There's also the smaller birds such as the bearded tits, which feed off of the seeds from the reeds. Of course, with any ecosystem, there's also bacteria which decompose the dead organisms. And in terms of the life cycle in the water, insects lay eggs in the water known as larvae. The fish and frogs then eat the insect larvae, and the sticklebacks and eels eat the fish. In terms of anything else you need to know for this ecosystem, you may be asked to expand on your understanding on what producers are, what consumers are, what decomposers are, and what nutrient cycling is. So how the nutrients begin from the producers and then the bacteria decompose them, putting them back into the soil. But let's now move on to the case study. So we've got case study of deforestation. We're looking at the Amazon rainforest. So first of all, you need to know a little bit of information about the Amazon rainforest, which you can see on this slide here. So on the left globe, you can see that the Amazon is massive. It spans so many places. In particular, it spans 8 countries and it's 8 million kilometers squared. However, the rate of deforestation is increasing rapidly, and there is roughly 1.4 million hectares being lost every year, which is very damaging. So the first thing you need to know about this case study is what are the causes of deforestation? Why is the Amazon rainforest being deforested? So the main reason may shock you because it's not actually logging, it's actually cattle ranching, which is a type of commercial farming for cattle. 200 million cattle are farmed in the Amazon rainforest, and they take a pasture of 500 million hectares squared. But on top of cattle ranching, another commercial farming that takes up a lot of land space in deforestation is soybeans as well, which is 250,000 hectares. Now, that commercial farming sector takes up 70% of the reasons of the causes of deforestation, but the other 20% is for logging, the hardwood, the softwood, mahogany, both for illegal and legal companies to exploit. The remaining 10% is a mixture of loads of other factors, such as mineral extraction, in which they would use explosives to get rid of things, and obviously the explosives would damage the environment. Population surplus in countries like Brazil, in which they are actually selling bits of the Amazon rainforest so people can live there because that's how high the population is getting. Also, talking about new energy development, hydroelectric power dams are being built there. However, they flood really easily. So those are all you need to know for causes of deforestation. Don't worry, you don't have to know every single one of them, as long as you know broadly what they are. Now we need to know impacts of deforestation. So the one positive impact on deforestation is the economy. It's boosting, all of the economies are profiting, so all of the Amazonian countries, in terms of logging. Just cattle ranching alone made 750 million in 1 year, which is amazing. However, now on to the negative impacts, which there are quite a lot. It causes soil erosion. Now, how does it cause soil erosion? Well, because of the trees being cut down. This then means that there's no canopy to cover the soil. And because of the rain, because it rains every single day in the rainforest, this will then wash out all of the nutrients in the soil. Now, because it's washing it out, this then leaves the soil very unfertile and new life does not grow there. Therefore, the trees that are being taken down cannot be replaced. Now, another negative impact is a contribution to climate change. Now, as you can imagine, when taking the trees, they not only are taking away the carbon sinks, but they are also reducing the amount of moisture, because the trees also release moisture back into the atmosphere. So without them, it would be very bad for the environment. Now, finally, you need to know strategies to manage the rainforest sustainably. So a key thing that changed the way deforestation was going was the Paris Agreement. Now, in the Paris Agreement, Brazil had pledged that it will reduce the deforestation levels by 80%, and so far they are well on their way to be doing that, so that's really great. Now, in terms of these specific strategies that they've done this by, they've done selective logging, which is logging only, say, a few trees in a certain area instead of eradicating all of the trees, so that it prevents soil erosion. And another thing is replanting the same trees that were taken away, so that it continues the sustained growth. Again, conservation and education. So conservation, encouraging the locals to take care of their environment, and education not only of the people in the countries to respect their environment, but also to people internationally, so that we become more conscious about the environment and our impact, and less prone to buying hard wood. Ecotourism is a really good solution, because in countries like Costa Rica, it makes a large proportion of their economy. I believe it makes 20% of their economy. It provides the locals an alternative job apart from deforesting the environment, and on top of providing an alternative route, it saves the environment instead of ruining the environment. Now, more reasons on a more international scale, international agreements on the use of different types of woods, as well as debt reduction. So countries promising to reduce the debts of the Amazonian countries if they conserve an area of the rainforest. However, sometimes this can get out of hand and is unsure whether the money will actually be spent on that. So a better solution is the conservation swap, in which you're securing that this certain area will be protected. Okay, so that is it for the Amazon. I seem to have missed the case study for cold environments, but let's just move on to coasts anyway. Don't forget that. I will come back to that in a later video. But now we are on to coasts and coastlines. So, from this we need to know an example of a section of coastline in the UK to identify its major landforms of erosion and deposition. So you can see here some really, really stunning pictures from Dorset. So you can see where Dorset is. It's in southern England on the map on the right hand side. And in terms of the pictures, so there are four main things that you need to note. Firstly, Durdle Door. So Durdle Door is an example of how you have what happens to a headland when it becomes eroded by hydraulic power and abrasion. And eventually, it's become an arch. So it was originally a big block, then it became cracks, then there was caves, that now there's arch, and in the future there's going to be a stack and a stump. That's called Durdle Door, and it's important to know that that was formed on a discordant coastline. Then you can see Lulworth Cove on the bottom left, and that was formed on a concordant coastline. So it's just a type of bay in which the softer limestone was being the softer limestone rock was being eroded faster than the harder rock in front of it, forming this really beautiful bay. Chesil Beach, which is a specific type of beach called a tombolo, which is just a specific term for a bar. And the last one, which is Swanage Bay, the Foreland and Studland Bay. So the bays are the softer rock, which have been eroded and caved inwards, and the foreland is the harder rock and the headlands protruding outwards. Now that's all you need to know for that. So let's now move on to an example of a coastal management scheme. We're going to be looking at Lyme Regis. So for this example, you need to know three things. Firstly, the reasons for management. So the reasons for management, why Lyme Regis needs to be protected, is because in 2003, I believe, 200 meters of cliff had slipped from the coastline, and because of this then put many houses in danger of subsidence and flooding and things like that. Now it's important to protect this area because not only is it a home to a population of 3,600 people, But in predicted 50 years, if the rate of erosion continued, then the key A3052 road would be completely destroyed. Furthermore, this area is also important economically because it provides a lot of contribution to tourism each year. I think there's 50,000 people that go there every year. Therefore, it would reduce that as well. So that's why it needs to be managed. Now we need to talk about the management strategy. So the management strategy came in phases. And after the cliffs had slipped, they decided to strengthen it. So many of these phases included the rip-rap and the which is also known as the rock armour, which is just putting rocks at the base of a cliff, at the foot of a cliff, so that it absorbs the shock energy and prevents the water getting to it. Eventually they just replaced this with a massive seawall because of the fact that the rocks kept falling down the beach. And an issue which some people had with the rocks, the rock armour or the seawall, was that it actually prevented the fossils that were found previously from getting extracted because they was covering the fossils. So some people were complaining against that. But overall, all of the things that they did, including dune regeneration, sand replenishment, all of those things actually ended up reducing erosion by 20% and also preventing any more from happening. So that is great. So in terms of any more conflicts, you could possibly argue that because of the prevention, this has encouraged more tourists, and with more tourists, it's encouraged more littering, which is definitely worse for the locals to have to deal with. But again, that's very minimal in comparison to saving the livelihoods of many people. Now moving on to the last two examples. So the first one is an example of an upland glaciated area. So this is Snowdonia. Now, you do not need to know too much about this. All you need to know is that what's spelt here as CWM is just a corrie, which is an armchair-shaped hollow. Llyn Ogwen is the ribbon lake in a U-shaped valley. And Llyn Idwal and Llyn Bockleywood are the tarns, which are just the lakes within the corries. They won't ask you too much about this, just whether you'll be able to recognise it. So looking at a map like you can see on the left is really important. You should be able to, for your exams, be able to identify them, and it's almost definitely going to come up in your exam. The last example. So you must give an example of a tourism in glaciated area. Now, we're going to look at the Lake District. So firstly, you need to know, what are the attractions for the tourists? Why do people visit Lake District? So people visit it because of the beautiful landscapes, as you can see in the background picture. Lake Windermere is beautiful. It's also known for William Wordsworth and Beatrix Potter living there, so it's great heritage. Now, what are the social, economic and environmental impacts? So because it's so busy, there's a lot of trouble with parking, and people can't really get their cars to fit on the actual roads, so they are ruining the nature and wildlife. The footpath erosion because of the amount of people. Also, the activities, the water sports and all of those things happening on the water disturbs the locals heavily, and they do not like it. And as you can see in one of the pictures, there's a lot of littering as well. So what are the strategies used to manage the impact? Well, resurfacing the floor, ensuring that they created a new car parking zone which was free for an hour so that people could still park there but also use that money to regenerate the area. And there's also limits on the knots of the water, so how much noise you can make. And also there's been more bins implemented which allowed people to not litter and recycle and things like that and look after the environment. Also, another possible issue was with the house prices for the locals. They were very high and extortionate, averaging on 350,000 when the average salary was only 20,000. So they decided to invest £10 million in creating 5 new houses, which will be hopefully much more cheaper for them. And that's it. Well done for getting through paper 1, and we're going to be doing a paper 2 video before your exam. I hope you found this helpful, and see you soon.